here to talk about springs, which we need to talk about, and we will continue to talk about for a number of years because we have a water quality challenge in springs. What we'll talk about is the settings for the water quality challenge in springs. Many of you know this, but a lot of our springs, if a spring is located in an area where there is human activity, like outside, not in the Ocala National Forest, then you will have a nitrate contamination challenge with your springs. And nitrate is a element, a form of nitrogen that comes from human and animal waste, and it comes from fertilizers that we lose off the landscape into the aquifer that emerge in our springs. And once they're there, they act like fertilizer and grow plants, which is algae. That is the correct slide. And so I'll talk about the two settings and how you think about them, how you think about solutions for these two settings that we have in our state that are influencing our springs water quality. What you see here is the rural setting, and that's the Santa Fe River. There's numerous springs along the Santa Fe River, but this is the area of the state, the Suwannee Valley Basin, that is predominantly agriculture. And you can see through the satellite imagery that those are all plots of farms. Some of them irrigated, some of them not, that absolutely require fertilizer if they're going to have a productive crop. And so our goal in these areas is to try to prevent that fertilizer from being lost to the aquifer and then emerging in our springs. You'll have not only crops where you need fertilizer, you'll have dairies and other just agricultural activities that create a nitrogen condition in the aquifer. So what we focus on here is how to keep it out of the aquifer. The Secretary talked to you about, some of the technologies. Everywhere where we have a spring in this state is going to be covered by a Basin Management Action Plan. That is required in the new law that we get those in place for all of our priority springs, which pretty much covers where springs are in the state. And once we adopt those, BMPs are required for these agricultural activities, best management practices. But we're going to go beyond that because we really want to get there faster. And so we're going to deploy infrastructure innovation, the drop-down nozzles, precise fertilization equipment, all those types of things to do what we want to do, which is keep nitrates, keep nitrogen and fertilizer in the root zone where the plants can use it. And so that involves better irrigation and it involves better fertilization because you want to keep it right in there. You got probes that we can put down that can detect whether it's getting past it or not, so you turn off your irrigation, right, because you want to keep it in there. We still are going to have storms. That's kind of the nature of Florida. And so that'll push the fertilizer through. So not only are we looking at getting, that fertilization precise, which is happening, we are also looking at how we can use less than fee land acquisition, payment for crop changes, those types of things in these spring sheds. And Suwannee's starting a program, Suwannee District. Are they here? Maybe? Yes, apparently they are. Someone's pointing. Over there? Raise your hand. There you are, Steve. Okay. Thank you. Leave me hanging up here, Steve. Just like in the legislature. I'm just kidding. So they are looking at, how can we partner with the producers to switch crops? Can we pay to go to forestry for a while? Can we go to a crop production rotation system? How can we partner to reduce the amount of fertilizer you need and apply in these settings? So we can eventually maybe get to a patchwork of high technology crops, low technology trees, some sort of patchwork to try to get to this water quality goal. And that's going to take investment from the state, and I'll just close with what that investment looks like. So that's the rural setting. Let's go to the next slide. So this slide depicts Silver Springs. Right in the middle of that circle is Silver Springs, and that is Ocala and in Marion County. And this is what I call the urban-suburban setting that's near our springs. And so click it once more. I do? Very nice. So that circle that just popped up is a wastewater treatment spray field. And you can see, there's a laser here. This is Silver Springs right here. Can't quite get, it's right in the center of that circle. And that spray field is right next to that, to the spring. So I don't know, Secretary, was it 2013, probably the first year of Springs funding, we actually put funding to remove that spray field. And so Marion County's decommissioning that spray field and moving that water to an advanced wastewater treatment facility 12 miles away. So that source will go away. So that's part of infrastructure, getting rid of, spray fields that are a good idea, but they got to be properly located. The second issue in this kind of setting is all that purple, magenta is, each one of those is a dot, and that collection of dots is a neighborhood on septic. And so what you see here is a lot of neighborhoods that were built that are all on septic, small lots, and each one of those septic tanks, even if it's fully functional, perfect working condition, is putting out up to about 60 milligrams per liter of nitrate. And we're trying to get to 0.35 in the spring. So that is another infrastructure issue that is very challenging for these springs. This type of setting occurs not only in Marion County, but it's also Citrus County and Crystal River, Hernando County, Leon County, and Wakulla County at Wakulla Springs, and Volusia County for Volusia Blue Spring, and then Orange County, Seminole County for Wakaiwa Springs. Every one of those springs has this exact same challenge with the septic systems, neighborhoods built on septic system. I don't want to stand here and say each septic system is bad, because that's not what we're worried about. It's the neighborhood where they're all coming out at the same time, and there's no room for anything to happen in the aquifer because the concentration is so much. So that infrastructure problem is challenging our springs. And you can see it's a lot of our state. So you got the agricultural setting, which is in Jackson County and the Suwannee Valley, and then for the rest of our springs that are impacted, you have this sort of urban-suburban. And there are some where there's a mix of agriculture, and then you'll just have to do that for both of them. So that's the name of the game. So how do we tackle it fast? Because when you deal with a septic issue, it's really challenging. You cannot just say, hey, let's go sewer that neighborhood, get the equipment out, start digging up the road. They'll be fine. That is not the way it goes down. Oh, by the way, once you're done digging up that road, give them a $10,000 bill to connect. That just doesn't work. So we realize this, and so the governor and the legislature have put forward a sizable chunk of funds to try to deal with this issue. And just in May, the governor signed Legacy Florida, which dedicated about $50 million a year to springs restoration, $50 million. That's a good chunk of money. And so we are out there trying to figure out how to deploy that money every year in a very cost-effective manner to deal with this situation, both in the agricultural setting, but the big price tag is the septic issue, that challenge we have. So we are, as part of the bill, the water bill that passed this last year was signed into law, the big new thing for springs and water quality is what's called septic system remediation plans. And so we're launching those at all those springs I just mentioned, all those areas I just mentioned, where we're going to bring utilities, community leaders together to really craft how we're going to march through this problem with either sewering or, fortunately, we now have the technology, retrofitting septic tanks with nitrogen removal technology. So we can do either of those depending on the setting, but it needs to happen, and the state is here to cost share on that because we need to offset those homeowner costs if we're going to make this happen. So $50 million a year, 20 years, that'll get us a lot of money. The total price tag for all these septic systems in our springs is about $2.5 billion. So that's a heck of a lift we have to do. But the procedures are in place. The law's in place to do the remediation plans. The funding is there to try to cost share. So I think we can get there. And I'll leave you with this. Wakulla Springs, south of Tallahassee, it used to be around 0.7, 0.8 nitrate impaired. TMDL was set. BMAP is in place. That spring, with wastewater improvement, with the city of Tallahassee and a few other activities, we're almost meeting the TMDL now. So I'm not just saying there's a lot of pessimism about whether we'll get there or not, but if we stick to this, do this kind of infrastructure, you can see the results. It will happen, because we've seen it in Wakulla Springs. So, Secretary, that's it from me. Who's next? We're taking questions at the end? All right.
Well, I want to thank the Secretary for the introduction and Drew for really setting my talk up. I've been working on septic tanks a long, long time. I won't tell you how many decades, but it was way back in the 80s I began my first research in the Florida Keys on this issue. And over the years, we learned a lot about nitrogen in the coastal marine environment and also fecal coliform. It turns out that a little fecal coliform bacterium, Serratium rescens, is what was causing the white pox disease on the elkhorn coral in the Florida Keys and accounted for a lot of the decline we have seen over the years in elkhorn coral. The good news is we've got new central wastewater treatment system in the Florida Keys with AWT, Advanced Waste Treatment. So that system is on the mend. Recently, I've begun working in the Indian River Lagoon in 2011, and I, of course, read the papers, and I heard all this farm runoff was coming in from Lake Okeechobee, causing all these problems up and down the Indian River Lagoon. And fertilizers and other types of farm runoff. And I thought, this is something that really needs to be looked at, because I know there have been a lot of people moving to the Indian River Lagoon area, those 5 counties. So for the first time, my partners at Harbor Branch and I began a lagoon-wide research effort all the way from Ponce Inlet down to Jupiter Inlet. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. These are the types of algae blooms that we encountered beginning in 2011, going up to 2015. And I know you've heard about a lot of these. The macroalgae, the seaweeds that have coated the bottom and built up over time, smothering the seagrasses. Invasive algae like Caulerpa, they look like seagrasses, this plant here, but they love high nitrogen, low light environments. This is a plant that took over the Mediterranean, a closely related plant, Caulerpa taxifolia. And of course, the phytoplankton blooms that are unprecedented. The brown tide, and of course the microcystis, the toxic blue-green algae we saw so much of this summer in the St. Lucie estuary. And of course, we've had, unfortunately, wildlife die-offs occurring mainly in the northern Indian River Lagoon, an area that's really not influenced by the Lake Okeechobee discharges. Manatee deaths. We're still working on that. As the seagrasses declined from the algae blooms, the manatees did switch their diet to eating a lot of these seaweeds. And that may have complicated things for the manatees. So one of the things we were interested in is looking at the problem of wastewater nitrogen in the lagoon, and septic tanks in particular. So we use stable nitrogen isotopes to trace the nitrogen source. We can tell whether that nitrogen is from fertilizer or from sewage by collecting the algae and looking at the ratio of N15 to N14. And what we found was that wastewater nitrogen was the major source of nitrogen fueling these algal blooms in Florida's Indian River Lagoon as a whole, the 156-mile length of the lagoon. And even in the St. Lucie estuary, where we saw the green guacamole microcystis this summer, what those isotopes told us is that water came from Lake Okeechobee carrying the seed algae. When it got in the estuary, you've got 33 or 34,000 septic tanks in Martin County, and more than that in St. Lucie County, coming down the North Fork. Meeting right there in the main stem of the St. Lucie estuary. And this is the Roosevelt Bridge. You can see that thick bloom, The isotopes showed how, as that bloom came into the estuary, it was growing and feeding on wastewater nitrogen. And it also encountered phosphorus concentrations 600% higher in the North Fork coming down from the St. Lucie River in St. Lucie County than was coming in from Lake Okeechobee. 600% higher phosphorus. So there are some real serious problems in the St. Lucie estuary. Certainly not all of them are associated with the Lake Okeechobee discharges. They've had chronic problems with fecal coliform in the North Fork, whether or not water is being discharged from the C-44. So if we look at the Indian River Lagoon from 1990 to present, this is the chlorophyll A, the amount of algae in the water column, phytoplankton algae. Those are the black dots. We put the chlorophyll numeric nutrient criteria on here, also the green line, that's way down at the bottom. That's what we want the chlorophyll A to be. Well, you can see how high the chlorophyll A is in the Indian River Lagoon. Greatly exceeds, and we see a very clear pattern over time with increasing chlorophyll, with these very high concentrations up around 300 or so, 200. These are really, really high chlorophyll levels associated with a super bloom, the brown tide. And the interesting thing about this, it doesn't have to be like this. Tampa Bay, by removing nitrogen from their wastewater, kick-started a recovery in Tampa Bay that reduced the chlorophyll A even as the population increased, and led to an amazing recovery of seagrasses, to the point now where the seagrasses in Tampa Bay have the same aerial extent that they had in the 1950s. It's really one of the best case studies I know of, not just in Florida or our country, but the world, of how nitrogen removal can lead to recovery of these ecosystems. So just want to close with my last slide, that a lot of us really didn't know how these septic tanks functioned. A lot of people think they're like advanced wastewater treatment plants underground, removing things like nitrogen and bacteria and viruses, but they don't. They're not protecting our aquatic resources. We have high groundwater tables and poor soils generally in many parts of Florida that really limit their ability to treat wastewater. And it's an inadequate infrastructure problem and a challenge for planners to prevent this problem from worsening and getting these areas like the springs and the Indian River Lagoon into a recovery mode. And clearly a challenge for legislatures to develop funding, matching fund programs for local governments to begin these septic to sewer programs. I'd like to, if we can, I'm going to see if this video is going to roll now.
Hi, I'm Dr. Brian LaPointe, research professor with Florida Atlantic University's Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute. I've spent decades studying water quality throughout Florida, including nutrient pollution and harmful algal blooms. This project with the Florida Chamber allows me and my colleagues an opportunity to share this research so the public can better understand how human activities are impacting Florida's water resources.
In this county and all throughout Central Florida, there was a huge growth spurt in the 70s and the 80s. And by the mid-1980s, we were already beginning to see significant water quality declines throughout the lagoon. If you fast forward to where we are today with between 250,000 and 600,000 septic tanks up and down the Indian River Lagoon, you see that the issue has just exploded in recent years.
Up and down the Indian River Lagoon Basin, you have an old network of agricultural canals that's slowly transforming to suburbia. And as that occurs, a lot of those new homes are sitting in this network of ag canals that form literally like a street grid of waterways, which eventually discharge to the Indian River Lagoon.
So in the Indian River, what we're seeing is a nutrient load problem. An overwhelming quantity of nutrients moving into the Indian River Lagoon, which has resulted in eutrophication, which has resulted, as a consequence of algae growth, and some of that algae has become toxic both to people and animals.
Now, the natural water tables here in Port St. Lucie are uniformly high, and as a result of that, septic systems are really not a good fit.
Septic tanks are not designed to keep pollutants out of pristine water bodies like the Indian River Lagoon. The agencies need to identify the areas where septic tanks are causing pollution to the lagoon. And we need to focus our efforts on conversion of those areas into advanced wastewater treatment.
It's another problem of inadequate infrastructure that we've created. It was based on an ag economy, and we've changed it now to a suburban-urban economy up and down that whole basin, and it just can't take that load anymore without properly treating it in a more centralized system.
You have to pay to have a clean Indian River. And that fact is just beginning to resonate. And again, it's changed. Why? And you have to have good science to explain the whys.
The one common denominator we know we all have is that we have old septic tanks that line the Indian River Lagoon from here in Martin County all the way up to Volusia. We already know, because we've done other neighborhoods, it's doable, and once it's done, everybody says, why didn't we do this years ago?
Thank the Florida Chamber for supporting that film production, and all my colleagues that appeared in it as well. Okay, thank you.
So good afternoon. I look around in the audience. I've been asked by the panel to give a little overview of some of the water quality challenges facing Lake Okeechobee, Central Florida, and the South Florida Everglades. But looking around the room, it's a little bit intimidating for me to be talking about this topic because there's no fewer than 3 former executive directors of the Water Management District in the audience, and several former senior staff members. So if I misstep, I'm sure folks will let me know. But it is a pleasure to be here and be a part of the presentation. I really appreciate the Secretary's kind words, although I would argue that agricultural BMPs as they currently exist, and probably the most effective set of agricultural BMPs that have ever been adopted and implemented, I think probably in the world, are implemented in the South Florida Water Management District in the Everglades agricultural area as a part of the district's forward-thinking move to try to aggressively deal with agriculture as a source of phosphorus to the Everglades. And that effort started out really in the early 90s and culminating in the development of a very rigorous rule-based program for the EAA. I don't have any slides, so I'm just going to talk to you and look you in the eye. And the real proof in the pudding is the success that BMP program has demonstrated over time. The 20 years that those BMPs have been in place, the average annual load reduction of phosphorus from the Everglades agricultural area, which is that large area just south of Lake Okeechobee that rings the whole southern edge of the lake, is in excess of 50%. 50% less phosphorus year after year after year going into the Everglades coming from the EAA as a result of that BMP program. That BMP program, in combination with, again, the district working with state funding and their own funding, constructing stormwater treatment areas, configuring them, doing extensive research in how to operate and maintain those stormwater treatment areas, and now augmenting those stormwater treatment areas with expansion and flow equalization basins through the Restoration Strategies program that's recently been adopted by the state and implemented with state funding and district funding. You've got water quality on the steady improvement in all of the water conservation areas and in all of Everglades National Park. The data clearly show that virtually all of the water quality stations across the water conservation areas are improving. Many heavily impacted sites are now no longer impacted. Most are meeting the 10 part per billion standard for phosphorus within the Everglades, and I always consider the water conservation areas and Everglades National Park as collectively the Everglades. It's a real testament and a success story of how forward-thinking policy combined with willing landowners to implement and operate and maintain these BMP programs, an aggressive commitment to research to constantly improve the quality of these practices, monitoring, and then augmenting that source control program with regional treatment facilities is really a classic example of how we can have a very dramatic impact on water quality in a relatively short period of time. This has all occurred over a couple of decades. Virtually all of this improvement, these programs, sequentially been installed since the mid-90s, and now, 20 years later, we're meeting water quality targets throughout the Everglades. I think one of the things that a lot of people don't appreciate, perhaps, is the delicate balance that has to exist between those best management practices and those regional treatment facilities with the total volume of water that we are forced to deal with as a result of just the environment that we live in. Weather is our biggest variable. You've heard a couple of folks mention that already. We don't control how much water we have to manage in any one given season or any given year. I think it's telling that in this past year, the December, January, February timeframe was the wettest dry season on record since they've been maintaining records for South Florida. Despite that, the BMP program still met its target goal, its target load reduction, in both the EAA and in the C-139 basin. And that's a challenge because the more water you have, the more load you're going to have to deal with. And despite that, I think it's a good testament to just the robust nature of those BMP programs and how aggressively they work and how carefully they're managed by the landowners. The other issue that I mentioned about the quantity of water is that quantity obviously can impact how the STAs perform, and it can impact how the habitats are managed within the water conservation areas in Everglades National Park. They have regulation schedules that have to be maintained for the integrity of the dikes that protect the urban areas of Broward and Miami-Dade counties. There are wildlife habitat issues that have to be managed. So these water conservation areas and the park itself have very strict regulation schedules that limit how much water the district can send through their STAs, through their storage facilities, and into the water conservation areas in the park. I think a lot of people don't appreciate that the Everglades are about half the size they used to be, and we're still dealing with essentially the same amount of water. It's impossible, I would argue, in my opinion, it's going to be impossible to send that same volume of water that historically went through the Everglades through a footprint that's half the size that it used to be. And so we have to continue to look at options not only to figure out better ways to manage the total volume of the water, but also how to balance that water volume with the variables that are inevitably faced when we have these very strict water quality targets to meet and regulation schedules that have to be managed at the same time. So the message from a water quality standpoint, at least from my perspective, south of the lake and into the Everglades is very much a success story. A lot of people, you don't hear a lot of positive stuff about it. There still tends to be a lot of negative press about it, but from my perspective, from my seat, having been involved in these programs for many, many years, it's a classic example of a successful program and one that's been integrated and really has become just kind of the norm for that part of the state. If I shift a little bit and look north of the lake, it's a different scenario, totally different agricultural landscape, totally different soil situation to deal with, an enormous watershed that starts about where we're sitting, maybe a little bit south of here, 5,000 square miles that drains into a 730 square mile lake. Water enters that lake at 6 times the rate that it can be discharged. An inch of rain on a wet watershed puts 4 inches of water in the lake. The challenges that we face with meeting water quality targets in Lake Okeechobee on a watershed of that size are daunting, to say the least. The bulk of the agricultural landscape, agriculture dominates that landscape. It's 80 or 90% of the landmass is in agricultural land. About 80% of that ag land use is relatively benign rangeland. It's improved, semi-improved pasture land. It doesn't get fertilized. It doesn't get irrigated. The challenge is stormwater management. It's how do we deal with the volume of water that falls on that 5,000 square mile watershed, and how do we control that in a way that we can meet the TMDL that was established for the lake in 2003, and now the BMAP that's been adopted in 2014 and just revised, or in the process of being revised now. It's a totally different set of problems to deal with. We've focused, I say we, I worked for the department for 31 years. It's hard to just disassociate myself from them. But the focus north of the lake has been on rehydrating previously drained areas, rehydrating wetlands, rehydrating sloughs, trying to figure out a way to slow that water down, to give it an opportunity to reside in an area where the phosphorus can be taken up by the plant material, it can accrete into soil over years and years, but it's really all about stormwater management. And the BMP program north of the lake is a little more diverse than the BMP program south of the lake. It's a more diverse community of agricultural producers. But nevertheless, they're basically the same. It's water management, it's nutrient management, it's tissue testing, it's soil testing to verify application guidelines, and irrigation management. But by far the biggest component of it is this stormwater component. How do we manage rainfall? And despite all of the BMPs that have been implemented, the latest data that the district routinely evaluates and publishes, I was able to see just a couple of weeks ago, they held a great open house at the Water Management District where all their scientists get together and put their work on posters. And Joyce Zhang, who I've known for years and years, had an update to the water quality monitoring of the inflow quality into Lake Okeechobee from the northern watersheds. And right now, it looks like things are kind of flat. There's no negative trend, there's no positive trend, at least for the most part. Water quality isn't getting any better and it isn't getting any worse. And so these BMPs that I've been talking about north of the lake have only been in place for about a decade. And we're still aggressively working with landowners through research and education and outreach to improve those BMPs. But it's going to take a long time for a watershed of that size to have a measurable impact on water quality in the lake. There's a lot of legacy phosphorus in that watershed. The benefits of the BMPs, which we know work based on research and published literature from folks that have evaluated the BMPs that have been implemented, we know they work on a farm scale, on a field scale. It's just going to be masked by a lot of the legacy phosphorus that exists in the soils, in the sediments, in various canals and conveyances, and in the wetland communities that dominate that landscape. So the challenge is daunting, and BMPs alone will never get us there. This is another thing that folks don't like to hear a lot of times is that they expect the BMPs on an agricultural watershed to meet the TMDL or meet the water quality target. And they're just not that good. Plants aren't that efficient in utilizing nutrients. We aren't that efficient. That's why we have wastewater treatment plants. We excrete a lot of the nutrients that we take in. We don't use them all. Plants are the same way. When you fertilize a crop, you're lucky if you get 50% uptake or 50% utilization. You have to put out 3 pounds to get 1.5 pounds into the plant. That's not uncommon in agronomy. So the challenges that we face in an agricultural setting, we have to deal with that. We can do as much as possible to adequately manage the input, right product, right place, right time, right rate, the 4 R's that you hear about. We can do everything that there is to do in managing irrigation, using remote sensing, using soil moisture probes, on-site weather stations, controlling systems with our smartphones and our tablets. But even in those situations, you're going to lose nutrients. It's just the facts. Until somebody does plant breeding to improve the rates at which nutrients are taken up by roots and translocated into leaves and fruit. And there's a lot of opportunity for that, I think, down the road. I think that's the next big development in water quality BMPs for agriculture is biology, better plants, drought resistance, more efficient plants in using nutrients is where the big next jump will be. But the point that I wanted to make is that the BMPs can't do it themselves, and we will have to expend significant capital resources north of Lake Okeechobee on storage and treatment options. Fortunately, the Lake Okeechobee watershed project planning has just been kicked off. That's the next step in the CERP planning process. It's just been kicked off for the northern watershed in the last 60 days. It's a 3-year process, but I would encourage those of you interested in that to keep your eye on that as that plan proceeds, because storage and treatment will have to be as big of a component north of the lake as they are south of the lake for Everglades restoration. Thank you.
Thank you all so much to the speakers, and I think Brewster's bringing up some cards. Just one, so look, hand them over. Y'all are all engaged in water issues, so don't be shy on asking questions. While he's collecting these, so Rich, you mentioned that better plants that essentially will allow for more efficient nutrient uptake or less fertilizer. Will the anti-GMO movement stunt a true environmental initiative, which is designing plants that use fewer nutrients?
Well, it's a great question. Yeah, I think it could. I do. There's a lot of emotion. I would argue it's mostly emotion on the anti-GMO camp. I don't know that there's any science that says genetically modified organisms are in some way a threat to our health or welfare. But yeah, they very well could, because I think that's what it's going to take is, you know, genetic modification. If you want to have a 100% efficient corn crop or tomato plant, you're going to have to genetically modify that plant to better utilize the nutrients that are necessary to grow it.
Okay, thanks, Rich. So this is a question for each of the panelists. If you had $1 to spend on improving water quality in the Indian River Lagoon, what would you spend it on? Drew, you want to start?
Sure. Secretary, that's not going to be enough money. You know, I'm a bureaucrat, so I'm great at evading the actual question that was answered. But in the southern Indian River Lagoon, in St. Lucie, you're going to have to deal with basically septic systems, local stormwater, and you're going to have to implement SERP, right? So you're going to have to get that done to deal with the southern system. The northern system, you're going to have to deal with wastewater, and that is the form of septic tanks. But you're also going to have to deal with another, you know, large stormwater features, because those exist in Brevard County and Indian River County as well, like they do in South Florida. You're going to have to redivert that water, capture it, and control that large slugs of stormwater as well. But at the end of the day, once you get the sources controlled, there's an amazing amount of muck in the bottom of the Indian River Lagoon that you're going to have to remove. So if you take $1 and you do one thing, you're not going to solve it. You're going to have to do all those things to solve these problems.
Dr. LaPointe?
Well, $1 is not going to go very far cleaning up the Indian River Lagoon, as Drew noted. I would say I would start based on my work. Wastewater lagoon-wide would be my top priority, and it's just not the stable nitrogen isotope data, but we have, data on DNA source tracking of bacteria and acetaminophen and sucralose. And some of the naysayers say, well, all that nitrogen could be coming from cattle and raccoons. Well, they don't use artificial sweeteners, I don't think, do they? So I would, and of course, nitrogen removal, I think we have to go more and more in the wastewater treatment plants, not just septic to sewer conversions, but I would say we need to go to more Barden-Faux and nitrogen removal at the treatment plants. Again, that's following the Tampa Bay model to get nitrogen, and I would say part of that dollar should be used to get a nutrient consortium, really, as they did in Tampa Bay, to get all the stakeholders together around a table to look at all the sources, and for the first time get everyone pulling in the same direction, working together. The finger pointing that's been going on is really a detriment to the progress on the Indian River Lagoon.
Well, so I can't argue with anything that's been said, but just to say something different, I would spend it on looking at the opportunities that may exist to capitalize on private landowners that are willing to hold water on their property, to diminish runoff. And one specific project that I think is very positive would be trying to reconnect some of the South Florida with the St. Johns River Water Management District, send more water north into the headwaters of the St. Johns. And
Dr. Shortell's cheering
I can see her
right
up there.
so.
She's got her arms up in the air. So it's the best you've looked all day, Ann. I got to tell you, you're looking better now. She's been sick. So. But anyway, and that it's twofold. It can eliminate a lot of the discharges to the estuary, and it can be a great source of alternative water supply or regional water supply for the CFWI. So it's a kind of a two birds in one bush kind of thing.
One of the great things about this conference is we have an informed audience, and they ask respectful but direct questions. And I think this one goes to Dr. LaPointe. Dr. LaPointe, would money spent on septic tank remediation be a better use of dollars rather than buying land south of the lake?
For the Indian River Lagoon, that answer is easy, and it's a yes. I don't see, that buying land south of the lake is going to have a big effect, particularly in wet season events in water coming into the St. Lucie estuary.
Hear, hear.
And the St. Lucie estuary is a very minor part of the Indian River Lagoon. I think it's very clear every septic tank that gets connected to a sewer, particularly with nutrient removal, is going to make a measurable improvement in the quality of water in the Indian River Lagoon. There is no arguing that.
Thank you. So our last question, Drew, the water bill required addressing septic tanks in the Springs area. Do you envision in future legislation or in other things that DEP plans to do of having a similar mandate for other water bodies?
We, as the water bill was passing, we did repeatedly make the observation that we have the authorities. We have basin management action plans where we can sit down and really work with local officials to craft the plans necessary to restore our springs. In the Springs bill, they articulated how they wanted us to develop that plan. We don't necessarily have to have that to go to the next watershed, to go to the Indian River Lagoon, to sit down with Brevard County, which we've done, and talk about putting together a plan for remediating septic tanks. The legislature may decide to move forward with something, but we are going to use the tools we have to try to get those plans in place as right now.
Big round of applause for our panelists.